So, colleagues, good afternoon. Now 10 minutes past 2, and we want to begin our conversation today. So the conversation today is on space economy, and the topic of today is we're looking at the African perspective and the opportunities within the space sector. And this is part of the celebration of the World Space Week. The World Space Week is commemorated between the 4th and the 10th of October. And essentially, we commemorate two main activities: the signing of the Outer Space Treaty, as well as the when we had the first human being who went to space. So in this conversation, we're joined by three panelists. Which I will introduce them later, but I start by introducing myself. My name is Charles Mwangi. I'm the Acting Director, Space Sector and Technology Development at the Kenya Space Agency. And I believe most of you are aware of the work that we do at the Kenya Space Agency, so I'll try and just keep it to a minimum. So the Kenya Space Agency was established in 2017. Yes, so as the agency here in Kenya, we are trying to see how we can deepen or grow the space sector because of a number of reasons. One is because we see space as one of the tools or instruments that we can leverage on to grow our space sector and create opportunities for jobs, as well as also, more importantly, to address societal needs within the country. So we focus on sometimes what we call two main sectors. There is what we call the upstream, that focuses on the satellites, how you get the satellite to space. That is the launch vehicles, as well as the launch platforms. And of course now the payloads, which again has the sensors that will take images or whatever other research that the satellites are able to do. That is what you call the upstream. And then you have the downstream, which again focuses on the applications and how we use the data that we get from space for decision support, for policy, for insights. And we also have a sector that is sometimes midstream, the one that connects the upstream and the downstream, where you have the ground receiver station, how you process the imagery, sometimes what we call the corrections, the atmospheric correction, the radiometric corrections, and the like. And we see a lot of opportunity on the whole value chain, from the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream. And that is where you're having this conversation. As we celebrate, the theme for this year is space and entrepreneurship. And the conversation that we're having today is to try and see how, as a country or as a region, we can leverage on the opportunities that this sector present. So as I indicated, we have three speakers. We have Davis Cook, who is the CEO of RIS. We have Mesha Kenya, who is the CEO of Marichet, and also part of the team working at the African Union. And then we have Sesinam Dagadu, the founder of SNUCOD, who is the winner of the Africa Earth Observation Challenge for this particular year. And we'll understand, we'll get a bit more insight from Davis what the Africa EO challenge is. So without further ado, I want to extend this opportunity for the introduction for Davis Cook to share a bit of what he has been doing and his work. So over to you, Ms. Davis Cook.
Charles, thank you very much. And can I just confirm that you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful, thanks. So firstly, thanks to the team at Kenya Space Agency and LeoSky and others for setting us up. It's always a pleasure to be able to share some of our experience and hopefully have an interesting discussion later. So as mentioned, I am part of the leadership team for an organization called RIS. We are an advisory firm that is focused on, amongst others, helping to grow the space sector across Africa. So, you know, we as a firm have been working in the space sector since 2015. So our introduction to space as a company was actually at that stage together with the South African National Space Agency, and we, collectively there sort of designed and came up with the idea for the Africa Earth Observation Challenge, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But over time, we have done work with a number of other government agencies. KSA is one of them, but we've worked alongside, for example, the Rwandan Space Agency, and many industry bodies across the continent. So in South Africa, this would be ZA Space. In Tunisia, it's Tunza. In Morocco, it's MISI, to promote the emerging space economy. How do we do this? We as an organization are not engineers, we are not technologists, but we are social scientists, we are economists. And for us, the reason why space is such an important kind of industry of interest is that, it is over the next 5-10 years going to become a really important economy in which we can create value, a geography in which we are able to create all sorts of useful data and activities. And it is a mechanism for us to help solve problems down on Earth. And while I think there is a very important element for the exploration side of space, it is still extremely important for us to continue to look back towards Earth and understand how do we use Earth to solve, or how do we use space to solve problems back on Earth. And so this requires a lot of thought about building out these space industries across the continent. And to do that, we have to ask questions such as, do we have the right human capital and the right skills in order to build a space economy of the future? Do our governments understand the value that space can provide? And not just at the space agency or a Department of Science and Technology layer, but across an entire government. So does human settlements understand this? Does education understand this? And so there's a lot of education involved at the policy level. We also do work in promoting the uptake of space-related products and services by industry. So what we find very often is that when you go to a private, like a large private commercial company, and you start talking to them about space, they immediately think about rockets and satellites and so on, and don't always understand the value that you would get from, for example, satellite imagery or location-based services. And so a lot of this is around education and awareness building. It's important to work with the venture capital community and the investor community so that they understand the value at a commercial level that can be created in the space sector. And that is, that then unlocks financial capital for us to grow the economy. And so when you put all these different pieces together, our work as an organization is very much focused on helping developmental-minded organizations, whether that's public or private sector, to think through these challenges, develop strategies to overcome them, and then ultimately to implement whatever those strategies are and create real change in the ecosystem. So we've been really fortunate over the last several years to be kind of one of the pioneers of this event called the Africa Earth Observation Challenge. We've just concluded the 8th event just 2 weeks ago. That took place at the South African Innovation Summit in Cape Town. The previous year, it was hosted by Kenyan Space Agency in Nairobi. And the purpose of this particular challenge is to support, in particular, downstream space-related companies So these are, application areas, not component manufacturing or launch or on-orbit operation, but people utilizing the space services to solve problems. And so the EO Challenge operates across Africa. It has support from a number of different government agencies. KSA has been a strong supporter for a number of years now. Industry bodies that I've mentioned previously. We also have a number of multilateral, kind of like much bigger organizations support us. So groups such as Digital Earth Africa, or the Regional Center for Mapping of Resources for Development, also based in Kenya. And then big private sector organizations such as Maxar, Planet Labs, Esri. There we are. This collection of some 20 or so kind of partners from local all the way up to global organizations are really working together to build a much more vibrant, emerging ecosystem around space. And I think this has really started to see some great impact. We've seen a number of the startups that have come through the program raise capital from various providers, and starting to sort of really scale up the way that they solve whatever challenges they are in their local countries. And that challenge has kind of dealt with maybe over about 250 entrepreneurs and startups from, I think, 30 different countries across Africa. This year we had around 26 countries applying and about 80 applicants, but it really has kind of scaled up. And so certainly part of what we have seen as an evolution for the African space ecosystem is that there is really a lot of interest that has emerged over the last 5-8 years compared to where we started. And the more we are able to create these success stories, I think the more vibrant our economy will be, and ultimately will generate value for us as citizens, as well as certainly like commercial value for the private and public sector that's driving us. Beyond that, I think like a lot of the work that we do is around broader kind of strategic guidance on some of these questions, and I mentioned that earlier. But ultimately, we're around partnerships, and I think that's what's really important when we think about space. It must be a collaborative approach. I think one of the important ideas that drives the work that we do is that we do not want to create the same borders in space that we see here on Earth. We don't want to create the same divides in space that we see here on Earth. And so this, necessitates a collaborative Pan-African approach. That's a little bit about us. I'm very happy to talk through some more of the work that we do as needed, and answer questions about our experience or how we've seen the sector grow over the last several years. Charles, back to you.
Thank you, Davis, for a great highlight. We'll get back to you in terms of what you've been able to do. And again, one of the interesting conversations that you're hoping to have is on the Africa EO Challenge. And right now we have one of the participants who was in that process, who will talk to us later. But before we, I want us now to move on to the next presenter, who is Meshak Ndirito, who is the CEO of Omarichet, and also working with the African Union. So Meshak, you'll also have like 5 to 10 minutes to share a bit of the work that you've been doing within the sector. Over to you.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks, Davis, for highlighting all that and making my work easy, because I will not, repeat all what you have mentioned. My name is Meshak, and I am the Space Applications Training Officer here at the African Union Commission, and we are implementing the African Outer Space Program, which I will talk to you in a moment. In about 1 or 2 slides showing you where the African space economy is, where we can offer it our services that we rendering, and those who are of course aspiring to be in business in entrepreneurship environment. Hopefully you can hear me. And
yes,
I'll just jump into sharing the presentation. moment. Okay, so let me give you a background, a little bit of African Outer Space Program. Back in the years, and I'm talking between 2013 to 2016, we developed what we call the African Space Policy and Strategy. And it was informed by the need that, all the cross-cutting areas of our Agenda 2063, if you look at most of them, they require interventions from science and technology, and particularly on space. And therefore, it became apparent that we really need a flagship program called African Outer Space Program to address those needs, and most importantly, to improve the livelihoods of the communities, the socioeconomic development part of it. And I'll take you quickly through all that, and we moved on to establish the African Space Agency, which now implements the African Space Strategy and the work plans that come along. But the African Space Program focuses on 4 main domains. So there is satellite communication, there is navigation and positioning, Earth observation, and astronomy and space sciences. And so we'll look at the market value of each of the 3, especially Earth observation, navigation, and communication. Fast forward, let's move to Earth observation and what could be of interest to on the entrepreneurial. So the value of the Earth observation in Africa, and why it's a big component when it comes to the socioeconomic development. Davies spent a lot of time explaining, how that value chain comes along and what they are contributing in Earth observation and cross-cutting with other domains. In African Union, we are also trying to do the same through projects like GMES in Africa. Focusing on Earth observation. We haven't found a program yet on satellite communication navigation, but I hope they will be coming soon as the agency matures. The agency is still not yet operational, but most of the facilities are ready. It's based in Egypt, in Cairo, and we are looking to operationalization within the next 1 or 2 years. Hopefully, we can begin the process next year. So looking at Earth observation, we have done a lot of surveys in preparation for the agency to come and implement different programs. And what we have observed is that there is a growth of the new space startups on this area, and there's a lot of interest or a lot of demand for services by end users. And these end users are usually communities like the fishermen, the farmers, those people who are dealing with the real end market of it. And our services are actually to come as middlemen to improve their services, to ensure that if a farmer has a product and they are looking into ways of accessing the market, how does technology help them to do that? If it's the same farmer, suffering from perennial droughts and unpredictable weather conditions, how do we help them to improve on their crop yield and so on? So that's where the space finds its main use. There are over 81 space application projects that are currently being implemented across the continent on EO. I just mentioned about GMES in Africa, but there are many others, including Surveil Africa and so on and so forth, Digital Earth Africa, and so on and so forth. Let's now look at that main value of Earth observation. A study that has been done by Digital Earth Africa and the World Economic Forum suggests that the EO has a value that could be unlocked on the continent to over $2 billion of return a year. And not only that, if we improve and make use of the data that comes from EO, we could yield more than $500 million in a year. And this could be due to increased fiscal revenues. We're also looking at the mining sector. The mining sector can, again, bring in more than almost $1 billion a year if we inject EO services into that sector completely and utilize the EO. Better data could potentially be worth an extra $900 million a year in the agricultural sector. we're talking of water savings, productivity gains, improving the crop yield, and so on and so forth. So there's a huge potential, and that explains why there are so many projects that have been injected onto the continent to realize, this sector. But I would like to say that the private sector is a really important input in this area, because they're the ones that usually connect the end users and ensure that every service that is being developed either by the public sector or otherwise reaches the end user and it's put into use. And that's what will revolutionize, not only the Earth observation, but other domains of space. Going on quickly into navigation and positioning, there's a huge market value on this. When we look at the continent as a whole, as you know, the African continent is the only one that doesn't have the augmentation system when it comes to navigation and positioning. And therefore, the services that are usually rendered, they rely on very coarse resolution, and we need precise measurements or location-based services that allows for every ecosystem to grow, like the e-commerce and many other, the transportation sector, the maritime industry. They all depend on navigation and positioning, but we need to do a lot of value addition in improving the precision of the signal. And the cost benefit analysis was done for an interregional space-based augmentation system in the civil aviation only, and this sector could accrue up to $2 billion over a period of 30 years. If you bring all the other services which are non-aviation, the scale even gets more high, includes probably $1 billion a year. And this goes into precision agriculture, it goes into maritime industry, fleet management, and so on and so forth. There are so many applications that if we improve the precision of the signal, we can unlock through the space-based augmentation system. And what I mean by space-based augmentation system is just taking the raw signal from any GNSS, service provider like GPS, and using, a satellite which is either in most of the time in geo to do some correction on the signal and send back that signal back to the ground. And that signal has, it reduces from an error of, let's say, 15 meters to about less than a meter or so. And that makes a huge difference in terms of service delivery, like in e-commerce, for example. The sample GNSS reference station, there is a need for densification of receiver station on the continent if we were to rely on improving the precision signal. So there's we have what we call, the continuous reference station, which are the cores, but there is still need for more densification. And if you look at this map, this was a study that was done with us and the IGNOS JPO, indicating that if you look at the Central African area, there's a huge, gap in terms of the core stations, which need a lot of densification to improve the signal. When it comes to satellite communication, just having a laser focus on the fixed satellite services and mobile satellite services, it generated over $1 billion in 2019, and it has been growing. So we could be looking at almost $2 billion currently and growing. And that's just on the fixed satellite services and mobile service market. If we move higher and include all the satellite communication services that can come out of it, we are talking of, again, billions of dollars accruing in a year. So this is to tell you that there's a huge market, and startups can, or new founded companies, or even established one can unlock this market. As you know, the rural community of Africa needs a lot of connectivity, not only for broadband, but if you look at, even the cellular connections that are existing, they are very few in the rural areas because of the return on investment of the telcos. And if you provide cellular backhaul and any other services that go with the telecom industry or the telecom providers, you will have your own cut in the business. So just to conclude, if we did a survey that included, it was called the socioeconomic benefits of space in Africa. It was just an informing exercise to tell us, is really space making sense? Is it improving lives? Is it going to unlock more value? It does, and as we have looked into all the three sectors, there's a lot of value, but there are also challenges when it comes to especially the new space ecosystem. There is for example, very low funding that needs to be reinforced, coming from government and other private sectors. You find that there are, new founded companies that don't, have the leverage to provide their services because of funding or lack of skills and so on and so forth. And we need to work together to improve on all those areas. PPP is found to be the best way to work when it comes to growing any sector. And I believe in space, we also need to bring in our perspectives of space, of PPP, ensuring that we work closely with the government, but most importantly, also to ensure that our new space ecosystem or startups are collaborating among each other. There's a lot of competition, but if you look at the competition, it's actually duplication of efforts. If we are able to come together and provide complementary or supplementary services, that would unlock a whole new dimension of entrepreneurship. So I think, Charles, I will stop here for now, but we can always, go to the discussion and elaborate more, discuss on how we can improve this sector.
Thank you, Meshach, for that highlight. I know a lot of reflections will also go into the presentation that you've shared, but I also want to rope in Sesinam Dagada, who is the latest winner from the Africa EO Challenge. I hope he still has the money. He hasn't spent all of it, and he'll tell us how we can reach him to share the goodies. But over to you, Cecina, and then for you, Sesinam, and just share a bit on your perspective. Again, you're coming in from the private sector. Share what you do. Who are you? What have you been doing, and how has the journey been? Over to you, Cecina.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Yeah, unfortunately, I've still not gotten the money yet, so we'll have to wait for that. Yeah, I actually come to this with quite a rich background. So I started my career working for Land Rover Jaguar, part of where I was working on active steering systems, which required sort of data about the sort of terrain to basically allow vehicles to predict the sort of demands that will be put on an engine in the next 30 meters, as it were. From there, I went to work in defense, where we did lots of interesting things, including building dynamometers for nuclear submarines, and most interestingly, the landing systems on, for example, the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier, which have some GPS augmentation. And then from there, I started working for the police, where we built things. One of the most, it seems really simple, but there was a big scandal while I was working for the police in London, where everybody was using the speaking clock, which was a time service that cost the Metropolitan Police alone, I think at the time about $650,000 a year, just to find out the time. Then we were able to build something that took time from GPS, and everybody could have very accurate timing. We needed the time to make sure that to sort of synchronize the times between evidence that was collected out in the field and real time, as it were. So you have a CCTV system that is 30 seconds out. You need that. What's it called? You need that level of precision, because 30 seconds could be the difference between premeditation and a crime of passion, for example. Then after that, I started working on a project which is what we won the award for, which is called Snoocode, where we are giving everybody on Earth an address. And yeah, and that has, morphed into many things, including emergency services on a day-to-day basis. So once you have an address, people can navigate to you if you give them that address. And so an example of that will be, what's it called? An example of that will be, using it as an address to find the nearest location. I think if I can share my screen very briefly, I am aware of the time constraints. So you can check it all out at snoocode.com, where we are giving addresses to people. And with those addresses, they can participate more fully in, every day-to-day social activities, get better access to public services like, sanitation, ambulance services, police, and things like that. And most interestingly, we've seen our technology being used in things as diverse as, election monitoring and, and verification of election results. And so and as I am speaking to you on the Starlink connection from Accra, Ghana. So you're sort of enveloped by, space technologies that are enabling everything. So my entire career, from automotive through defense, through digital forensics, and now with, digital addressing, have always benefited from, space technology to various extents. But I think it's something that, far from being, a very, out there concept, we are bringing it to the point where it is, people make use of it every day. Every day, yeah. So you use it to get your mail delivered. You use it to, find help in an emergency. You, what's it called? You use it to, what's it called? You use it to, sorry, there's all kinds of messages coming up. You use it to monitor your elections. You use it to sign your contracts. You use it to, manage, a developing economy. And it's not, there are lots of advantages that you have that, the more developed economies of the world did not have at this stage of their development. And I think that's something that we are, very happy to facilitate and encourage with our work.
Great. I want now to rope in Davis back to the stage. So I'm going to take a bit of time, and Meshach as well. So I want to take it from the conversation. Davis, you did mention at one point some of the issues. You mentioned the finance, the money bit, the venture capitalism, the venture capital. Do you think we have enough of that within the region? You alluded to it, and maybe also says you can also indicate whether that money has been forthcoming within the region. Maybe Davis, if we could go first. How are we doing in terms of the funding for these startups?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I want to start by saying that venture capital in Africa represents around 2% of global venture capital. So Africa as a whole, across every sector, is still very small in the overall kind of investment world. And there are many reasons for that. A really important one is that investors outside of Africa usually believe, in my view, inappropriately, that there is significantly more risk to doing work in Africa because of their own particular kind of backgrounds. And I think this is an important point to remember, just that there is, for international investors, there is obviously an additional kind of what's called like Africa discount or Africa risk. One day we can get into a different debate about whether that is appropriate or not, and many of us will feel that it is not. But it is a reality in terms of like a US or a European or a Japanese investor. So with that being said, venture capital across the continent has really outperformed every other region globally. Even in the last few years, where we have seen a really big downturn in venture capital in Africa, this has been matched by kind of performance of the industry across the rest of the world. And so we are not alone in that decline, but we are still growing faster than most other regions. And so even though we have a small percentage of venture capital, it is some of the best performing venture capital globally. The problem that I see at the moment is investors, you know, when you start talking about space as an industry, this raises additional concerns or risk for them. And so now you're piling on an industry risk around space to, you know, a geographic risk. And this decreases the amount of venture capital, I think, that investors are willing to put into local space-enabled companies. So our view on this is two things. One, there is a lot of effort we need to do to educate the market and to educate the investor community about the space industry. But secondly, is really to talk about the value that this has at the end user or the consumer level. So we don't do things in space just because we like space. We do it because it has an impact in agriculture, in illegal mining, in disaster management, in urban settlements and planning, in water management. That's where the value is created. And so I think a big part of the conversation that we've started to see in the investor community is not so much around space, but rather space-enabled applications in other industries. And I think this is an important shift away from the idea of just space as this very high-tech kind of world that only NASA can play in, towards something that is very real for us as Africans. And that shift in conversation is important.
So if I can bring in Ses, and Meshach will get to you because you have worked across the Africa region. How risky are we? But let us hear from Ses first in terms of how easy has it been to get funding? How has your journey been in terms of trying to get enough resources to develop the products that you're developing?
Okay, so our funding story has been a little bit unusual. As I mentioned, I used to work in defense and for the police and things like that. When I left the defense sector and started working for the police, I still got, consulting gigs from my former employers. And eventually, it started interfering with my day-to-day work with the police. Long story short, I got called into a meeting by one of my employers, and they asked me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "What's it called? I was building an addressing system. So I was working for the police, and they said, "No, Seth, you always have a secret project. What's your secret project?" And it was an addressing system for, Africa. 48 hours later, I had, I think, about £200,000 in my account, so I didn't even really ask for money. I just got given it, right? Because it seemed like an important enough problem to solve. Interestingly, about 2 months before that, I was talking to, at the time, the largest telco in Ghana. And they had offered $100,000 for 51% of the company. And I had just gotten £200,000 for 10% of my idea, right? And so that literally highlights the story, right? All these years now, I think we've taken in over $2 million. And we have an addressing system that covers the entire globe. We are now branching into many, many, many different industries. And the interesting thing is when you start talking about risk, yes, there is a risk premium in Africa. There's no denying it, but it is nowhere near, the sort of perceptions that what's it called? That the venture capital community has about Africa. I'll go as far to say that there really isn't in practical terms any sort of venture capital activity. Well, there's very, very little, even below the 2%, right? Because if you look at the venture capital money, the way I understand venture capital is, that is money that is sent out to take risk. I'm sure if you examine the 2% that you talked about, it's always for very mature companies that are way more mature than you would expect. You would have them in in Europe or in the US. And to date, all our money has come from outside of the continent. We pride ourselves on having, a very, very low burn rate that allows us to be, and that's one of the ways we mitigate our risks, right? But even with that, it's always been difficult to find, to find funding on the continent. At this point, we always, really hesitate to ask for funding, because can you imagine what would have happened if the people who funded us in England knew that, the offer from, a company that is on the continent, that understands the problems, and that has the capital to do it, was 100,000 for 51% of the company. We wouldn't have gotten that. And what would have happened is that 100,000 would have, gone into the company, and, it would have fizzled out very quickly, even though we have a very, very low burn rate. Throughout the history of this company, nobody has ever been paid more than $3,000 a month. So that just shows how how frugal we've been. That is still not enough for a lot of venture capital companies, but the opportunities are huge. I think we are not solving first world problems. We are solving real problems. We are solving problems about delivering internet to the last to people in rural areas. We are solving problems about elections that impinge on almost every aspect of life. We are solving problems about sanitation and adaptation to global warming, and the forward march of electric vehicles and things like that. And so it seems like the perfect sort of mix for a venture capital firm. But this perception or this exaggerated or outsized perception of the Africa risk premium is a real problem, and it needs to be dealt with. How we'll do it, I have a few ideas, but I do not feel confident enough in them to put them
we'll get back to you, Says, and you potentially have to share that because again, the idea of having this conversation is to see what could work, and also again some lessons here. I hear a common thread also with what Davis was indicating, that there is need to tie your solution to a need. Which I think is important, and maybe that is something that we can reflect on later in terms of how do we ensure that the startups are also succeeding when they get the seed funding. But I want to bring in Meshach. How risky are you? You just told us that we have to go the PPP way, but you're being told there is no money in the sector. But again, Ses is here. He will share some ideas in terms of how we need to overcome that. But over to you, Meshach.
Yeah, that's an interesting story, Charles. Ses has, like he said, an unusual path to entrepreneurship. So if I come back to your question, I think one of the things that we've been suffering from as a continent is actually to bring this sector into the development circles, like ensuring that even the development partners really recognize the need for space-based applications, whether it's upstream, midstream, or downstream. And if you have a bankable project today and you walk into, let's say, African Development Bank and it's a space project, there are less than a 1% chance that you get the money to develop your own infrastructure or whatever you want to develop. And this has been a fight with all the development partners to really start recognizing space as one of the socioeconomic development pillars. It is an enabler for all the development, but then this issue of qualifying, the risk, and also if you add that risk to the geographical location where we are, it becomes so difficult to really put through an important project on that account. But if you look at it carefully, the practice of most startups that I've seen is actually, they register both on the continent and they also register offshore, which is not really optimal if you ask me. There shouldn't be any risk factor that gets associated with just geographical locations. And the message is that we have success stories on the continent. If you look at e-commerce industry, for example, there are companies that have established themselves and they are spreading. If you look at other sectors in energy and etc., companies that are doing, started from scratch and they are doing a lot more. But this boundary that comes with space and other technology, companies is really, it's not realistic, like Davis and Seth said. But in the reality of what we are doing, in the reality of where we are, still being able to account for that risk factor, I would say that we should come up with ways, like I said before, the startups need to also come up with ways of working together, just to weather through, the conditions that are existing before we can be able to pull, bigger funding and other instruments that can enable the new space ecosystem to grow. But beyond that, I think that we talked of fronting the solutions before even the technology. Perhaps there's a lot of convergence of different technologies. Seth was talking about address systems, and I'm sure space finds its use in that. But then if you look at the solution he's presenting, it doesn't have, no one would think that there is a correlation with space, but they front, the solution first. And I think this is what needs to happen so that we don't remain in the silos of, space technology, while there are other, technologies that we can take advantage of. Look at, for example, the convergence of IT and space that is existing, cloud computing, all these, technologies that are coming together to improve, to create an integrated service that provides the solution that people are looking for. Even in the space domain themselves, not distinguishing or removing those boundaries between satellite communication and observation, we can come with very integrated services that can, serve the end users in such a way that people would not even think about space anymore. And if you take that to the bank or to any other, provider of loans or financial instruments, they will see the solution, and the back end will remain space technology and other types of technology.
So I want to rope in Davis. And there's a concept that Meshach has brought in, and again also I know Seth will also rope you in. There's a concept of the bankable projects, and again, Davis, you've been part of the Africa EO Challenge for some time, and you've seen the proposals that has been put forth. Yeah. How do we ensure that we are putting forth bankable project? What are the gaps that you have noticed that we, again, I believe the audience here would be interested to understand what do they need to do, especially if you want to leverage on the new space economy that is emerging within the sector? Your thoughts?
Yeah. So thanks, and some really great comments that I want to pick up on from Seth and Meshach. So I think that the first thing that I want to say is that the quality of space-related entrepreneurs and startups has improved dramatically over the last 10 years. If I think of what we saw as ideas for space-enabled businesses in 2015 compared to where we are today, they are, they're worlds apart. And I think that that's a natural aspect of the ecosystem, is that people try things that doesn't work, they come back, but they understand the sector better, and inevitably they become more mature entrepreneurs. And I think that we are seeing that process happening. I think this is just a natural evolution of the innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem. I think that there is a problem that all of us in the industry have, which is we are very passionate about space, and that is in many cases a barrier, because the people that we are talking to are not necessarily passionate about space. They're passionate about the problems that they solve, but we talk about this as being, space. And so we need to find a way, I think, as a community to bridge that gap, to talk about the value of space for people, as opposed to just talking about space. And I think that we have not yet collectively solved that problem. So I think that is a common challenge to get beyond. I think at the entrepreneur level, we've seen this really improve over time, but I think this is still a big challenge, is really getting in to understand the real need of a particular customer, and not solving things because I have a solution that I want to push. So I think that there are still many entrepreneurs who are very technology oriented and they don't listen to customers very carefully. And I think that is, at the entrepreneur level, I think that remains one of the biggest challenges that we see in the sector. But I want to pick up on one of the bullet points in the slides that Meshach showed, which is that no private company in the space sector can be successful without government.
I saw that as well.
and I think that this is true everywhere in the world, that the space sector requires a great partner in government to help them be successful. And it requires government at a policy level to support not just the space elements of what they're doing, but also connecting to the entrepreneur policy, the trade and industry policy, the education policy. So you need a strong kind of collective government response to support a successful space economy. That's at more of the policy level. I think that you also need it at a strategic level in which government is able to set a very clear, at sort of like an implementation agency level, a very clear direction for where a local space economy can go, whether that is in application development, or it could be like image processing, or it could be midstream, like whatever it might be, to say this is what our aspiration is, and give the private sector the confidence to invest into companies that can service that market. The private sector, I think, only ever invests into companies if they believe that there is a future market for them. And government is such an important customer for space-related services that if you can close that gap, you can really drive a lot of interest into the application areas. And this requires, to what you were saying, this requires the startups coming in with ideas of services that can be offered, and it requires government to come in, not just at the policy level, but to say that we require these services, creating a market. And that is exactly what has happened everywhere else in the world. And I think that if we can unlock that, I think we can really drive a huge amount of services, of data here, because we are already buying those services. It's just that we are buying those services from countries in Europe or Japan or China or the US.
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, one of the other perspectives that I've had is I've attended a number, because we ourselves, we are government. I've attended a number of functions in government where the government says what the issues are, the needs are. But when you look at the meetings, we have very limited representation of the private sector. Then you go to conferences where brilliant ideas are being shared, and there are no users who are there. So again, I think there is need for us to bridge that gap. And maybe I want to bring Seth, given that you have been within the sector, how important is government in terms of supporting the growth of the new space economy?
Well, I would say government is absolutely crucial, and especially with regards to, I think sometimes the things that governments don't do is as important as the things that they do, right? Which is, for example, I'll give the question of Starlink, for example, right? In Ghana, we've had a bill of about $350 million to extend internet to people in rural communities. Also cellular services. And so the government has been going around, cup in hand, trying to find money to do this thing. And then comes along Starlink. And it's for example the perfect solution, right? And it's not very dense, so it cannot really take away market share from what's it called, for the whole city of Accra. I think we can only deploy about 1,000 at the current density level, about 1,600 Starlinks for the whole city of Accra. MTN alone has 1.2 million customers in Accra, right? So it's like a drop in the ocean. So competition-wise, it's not, but in the rural areas where there's no connectivity at all, you can go from 0 to very, very good speeds, almost overnight. They've been trying to get a license now for, 3 or 4 years. And all kinds of things come up as, barriers, but, I think the technical term for this is it's all nonsense. Because ultimately you have a situation where you had no solution. Now you do have a solution with competition on its way, right? So even concerns about having a monopoly are not even valid. Then you look at things like addressing systems, which is our field. And we've had in your country, for example, SNU code already works. It covers every single square inch of Kenya. And it works offline. It does, it flies drones and all of that stuff. And, and we've been through like 4 or 5 sessions of bidding, albeit with previous administrations, but 4 or 5 rounds of bidding where you bid and then the wrong person wins and then it gets cancelled and things like that. Now, when you're dealing with an industry where funding is low, that these sort of long delays in implementation of projects can often be the death knell for a lot of companies in these sectors. I think some of us have long given up on government's ability to support, and we've now gotten to a point where we are setting the bar really low. We are asking them not to hinder rather than to support. And it's sad, but the encouraging thing is that more and more the technologies that are coming online are technologies that the general public can vote with their feet, right? So yes, if you're willing to pay the premium, you can have a standing connection for £200 a month, no matter where you are in the country now. But it should be around 50 if the government, allows, an entity to operate. So as far as the governments are concerned, I think they are, how do I say this nicely? They're a very special set of people. But yeah, I think taking their foot off the necks of progress is really what they need to be doing as a first step, even before we start talking about them supporting. But that may be a somewhat pessimistic view, but I think it's realistic.
And I want to move the question again to Meshach, but there's a question on the chat, Meshach, which is talking about PPP. If you can review that, but I want to again, we are a bit over time, but I want to bring in Davis. There is a comment you made in terms of the domains, in terms of people who are engaged in space. There is always the assumption you have to be an engineer, you have to be a scientist. There was another dimension, although it was mentioned in passing, it caught my attention in terms of who needs to be within the industry. And it's also interesting to hear that Seth came from Land Rover and now he's in what we might call space. Who needs to work in space? Before now, again, we throw it back to Meshach on the PPP. And also, if you can mention in terms of the government, you have a view of the 54 governments. Why are we not able to move? So, but let's start with Cook, and then we go to Meshach, and then we'll do a quick round of concluding remarks.
Sure. I'm certainly going to defer the question about our 54 countries to Meshach.
Yes.
I have not qualified to answer that.
Yours is on the people, disciplines.
Yeah.
And then Meshach will handle the ones for the whole continent.
So I want to answer this by talking about Hollywood, right? Because probably one of the most important space exports of America are Hollywood science fiction movies, right? Because what do? They get children excited about science and space. They, we think about NASA as this incredible organization, but it's a movie industry. When you think about science fiction authors that children read at school and learn about what is possible for them, there is a whole industry of English education devoted towards literature related to space. Now that's maybe at an extreme example, but who are the people who are looking at space law? around space debris. There's an entire legal world that is emerging as lawyers. Who are the accountants who understand space businesses, right? You don't have to be an engineer, but the question in the chat came up around like project finance. You need to have a very good understanding of financial modeling and instruments and risk calculations to be able to fund this. We at Rees are full of economists who are studying the industrial economics of space. So there is every job that you can imagine exists within the space industry. And it is not just about engineers. Of course, we need the engineering because without engineers, we can't have a space sector. But to build an industry requires accountants, human resource practitioners, lawyers, artists, authors, economists, journalists. So every job is possible. And so I think that this is maybe another really important role for us collectively as a community, that we need to move this away from being the exclusive reserve of a few brilliant engineers to a sector that can include everyone, and that we can really generate a lot of value for people as opposed to just a small sector. I think this is a big challenge to overcome. But the short answer is everyone.
I like the comment that was shared by one of our board members, John Chesson, who happens to be a space lawyer, who says space is multidisciplinary and there is space for everyone, which again means that we can all find our own space within that domain. And I like that perspective. Meshach, back to you. What are we doing wrong in the 54 governments that Seth is mentioning? And he has tried very hard to put very kind words across, and we're not coming across.
Well, I will try to address as much as I can, but what we observe is that there is no proper laws or any system in most of the governments to allow the space ecosystem or new space startups to grow. They have to find their ways by themselves. One of the challenges that when we did the survey and we got feedback from most of the companies that were talking about, one of the hindrances is actually the legislation. And Seth was I think he was alluding to that as well, that they're at a point where they're asking the government not to hinder rather than to actually ask for support. And I understand that there's a lot of hindrances going on for lack of proper legislation processes in most of the governments, and that discourages most of the companies. Going beyond that, you also have challenges of the funding. There are no proper funding models. Davis and Seth were referring to some numbers. I understand there's a lot of growth in the inflow of venture capital, but if you look at it, it's all coming from outside. And let's be honest, if it looks big, cumulatively, but if you assess one by one, you realize that there are 10,000, 50,000. It's a good figure, but $50,000 in a space startup may not help so much. You're talking of skills. You're competing with other industries that are fetching the skills, and again, the other factor is that people who are also skilled, they are on demand, in other continents. So you're competing your small salaries or as a startup with big salaries on the same people, which are being offered elsewhere. And how do you navigate that? You essentially become like a training ground for people to just be moving outside your startup. So there's one is that there are the registration processes are not very clear. At least we have some few countries that have space agencies that can really work with and nurture the private sector. But one other thing that we're also seeing is that some space agencies are also competing with the startups. They are when you issue a grant, for example, in Earth observation, whichever area, you will see space agencies competing with the same, startups that are supposed to be nurtured. So these are some of the areas that we need. And PPP, I meant, public-private partnership, where we come together as government, public sector, civil society, and nurture the ecosystem, because it's a whole new ground we are breaking. It's not very existent. I think in South Africa, it's a little bit better organized. Davis, you might agree with this, that it's easier. There's already an ecosystem existing or trying to exist, which is very well appreciated. But in most of the countries, you find that there is no legislation, there is no recognition of the domain, and therefore there's a lot of uphill task for the companies that want to grow from there. So what most of them do, some of them, I would say, they nurture themselves outside and then they come back to the continent, because they have known that perhaps some government listen to some services coming from outside as opposed to internal funding, and that shouldn't happen. We should be at a point where the space agencies and the ministry or the government as a whole to support the ecosystem. But that will take time. It will take time. Even the African Space Agency will, it's still struggling to stand on its feet. And this is a public institution, an intergovernmental institution. So also you can imagine the case for the ecosystem. But if the Space Agency comes to its feet and it's able to mobilize some, let's say, investment capital, that will be okay. As I close, I think Charles, I have been referring to this, that we also need our development instruments like AFDB and others needs to also take into account or accommodate space and other big infrastructure projects coming from the private sector. And that's where you find that PPP model actually applies best, because I don't think they would give a lot of funding to a private sector because of the high risk in terms of managing the fund, as it would be if it's a PPP model.
Thank you, Meshach, for that. And again, I know the conversation is getting more interesting as we progress on, but I notice we are a bit over the time. And I want to bring everyone in again again, we have to wind up. I want to invite you to share your comments, and I want to start with Tess. One of the very interesting things, and I know, again, based on the metrics that has been shared, GNSS and satellite communication seems to be taking quite a huge chunk of the space sector funding. And it is interesting to see something in Africa that seems to be driving. Maybe but the question that I want to ask is, because we have members who are attending here, what would you advise them in terms of, if you want to start to start your startup company, what should you do? What is the magic thing that will ensure that they are able to continue offering the service or continue to grow? Says, can you hear us? Okay, as we wait for...
Sounds like Elon Musk interactive connection there.
The Starlink connection has been severe. Maybe the government is not happy that he's sharing. Yeah, but now, as we wait for Seth to jump in back, I want to go back to Davis. What in terms of our again, coming from the consulting world, what do you feel is the gap that we need to fill? For it could be from the government or from the private sector or from any of the players within the space ecosystem. What do we need to do in a minute or two?
Sure. So I want to split this across shorter term and longer term activities. Yes. In the short term, I think that there is a lot of work that, in particular at the agency level, that can be done in partnership with existing entrepreneurship communities. So there are innovation hubs and accelerators and angel networks that exist in every country across Africa. They already have the entrepreneurs, they have the desire, they have access to all the things that we want. And what they don't yet know is they don't know enough about the opportunities provided by the space sector. And I think that a very easy way of growing an emerging economy, which is what new space is, by definition requires entrepreneurs, right? An industry that doesn't exist is created by entrepreneurs. And so I think for agencies to work with their local innovation communities is a quick win to get more activity in the sector. And I think that that's something that it can be done in the short term. In the longer term, I think it's really important for the industry as a whole, but I think in many ways driven by agencies in the public sector, to find ways of inspiring younger people to move into space careers. And you do this by supporting education, by supporting the arts, by supporting awareness building programs. And that will take time. It takes time for a 10-year-old to become a 30-year-old engineer or lawyer. But you have to start. And if you are not producing this pipeline of future space professionals, there will never be a community in country that can service that industry. So that is a long-term goal around inspiring people. The short-term goal is much more practical, and that is work with the local entrepreneur and innovation communities who already have all of the infrastructure and networks that you need. What they're missing is an understanding of how amazing the space economy can be.
Thank you, David, for that. Over to you. I see Cesar, are you about to give a comment? I see you muted.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I didn't hear the last bit of your question.
The question was what would be your advice to anyone who wants to set up a startup, and how do you ensure that it becomes sustainable?
Well, it's not. I think there has never been a better time to do it. As a small startup, you now have access to quite a lot of technology. But to sort of echo what Davis was talking about, it's really about this, the problems that you are able to solve, real problems on the ground. And I think, this is one of the biggest lessons that we learned, and I think the metaphor was, we went out and, discovered bricks, and we went around trying to sell bricks. And we said, you can build all kinds of things with these bricks. But what people want are not bricks, they want houses. They want a special house for, a special building for living in, a special building for, housing their dogs. There's a special building for working in. And for a lot of us, we feel like if we can imagine the possibilities, we feel like we've done the heavy lifting, and it's up to other people to just put the bits together. And although it is, the majority of the costs of, building things, it is important to build finished solutions for people. Now, once you build those finished solutions, people may still want to take them apart and reassemble them in the way that they want. But, it's hard for, a lot of makers who are often, 60-year-old men to imagine what difference that these technologies can make. And unfortunate as that is the opportunity. So yeah, so that's the advice I would give.
Thank you, Seth. And I want to move over to Meshach and to give your final remarks. And I wanted to rope into something that Davis had brought in terms of the solutioning. And because again, I know you've been involved in the GMS project in terms of how do we, and also it was also alluded to by Seth in terms of you have, if I might call them foreign companies, when I'm looking at Africa, providing solutioning within the different regions. And how do we work the balance between that? And again, also in terms of the uptake in terms of the products that have been developed. Maybe you can use the experience from GMS or any other experience in terms of how has the transition been for product development to uptake, whatever perspective you want to handle as we wind up.
Okay, thank you, Charles. I think first of all, I want to emphasize, the factors that the two speakers have highlighted, that the ecosystem or the new space startups need to work together. I think networking is very important when it comes to developing solutions and finding a way in the market. And networks, come through showing up. You must show up in any event or platform like we are here. You get to learn a lot of things. If you don't show up, then you remain in your silo and develop your technology that won't find any meaning. And I think that is also for everyone here, that you need to also go out and talk to people, understand the pain points before designing the solution. Or because we have as engineers, we can engineer our own problem and solution in the silo and develop it and find out that there is no market for it. The other thing is that there is a very good existence that I'm seeing coming up very well. As we build up to the PPP, I think new space or any startup, it's very important to work with an academia in ensuring that it's the only, if not the only, but one of the viable ways to have affordable skills that you're looking for, and engage them in the pipeline. The academia, they can, students can offer internship. They can provide you with the skills at affordable prices or at affordable rate. And working through with the academia, one of the other advantages is that there are grants that usually come through academia, and that can be piped through that partnership. So I think that's very important. As we bring in public institutions, let's also not forget the importance of academia in building the new startups or the new space ecosystem. And I think this is one of the ways we focused on when the project of GMS in Africa was being formulated. Grants in traditionally the grants used to be for public institutions. You just work with an institution like, let's say, Kenya Space Agency. You give them the grants, they implement what they proposed, and that's all. But in our own, when we formulated GMS in Africa, it was the same project, funding through the same models, but the grants we were able. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so the grants, we were able to bring in the private sector and academia to for everyone who was bidding for the same grant. We asked them that it's mandatory to bring in the private sector and to bring in the academia, because that's the pipeline of sustainability. And we have seen a lot of growth in the new space companies in the EO. Out of the at least 20% of the grants is ensured to go to the private sector, which is in the EO, development of services, training, and every on the technical side of EO.
Thank you for that, Meshach. And I see Seth has one, and please keep it short, Seth. I see your hand is up.
Sorry. Sorry, that was an accident. I have.
Okay.
Said
Okay.
more than.
But we really appreciate members also for participating and being there until the end. We apologize we took much longer, but again, I feel this is a conversation that we could have continued for the longest. Again, I want to thank Davis Cook for your time, Meshach for your time, Ses for your time, for your insights. I think it was a huge learning also for myself. I have takeaways from this conversation. Legislation, as emphasized by Ses, he wants us to give Starlink the licenses and the like, but essentially not in terms of Starlink, but how do we open up those opportunities within government? And again, also linking the problems to the solution. And again, also as well as also unlocking the potential that is within government. So that again, the support that comes from that, and also leveraging on the opportunities, the likes of the innovation hubs, the importance of networks, because again, we need to grow. And again, I think also as we wind up, the challenge that we extend, especially to the private sector and the government, is to explore how they can work together, because the government sometimes have most of the problems. The private sector has the agility. And again, we have to see how we work together and also try and hasten our steps, like Ses was indicating that government is not as fast. But again, those are lessons. We want to sincerely thank you. And again, from the Kenya Space Agency, we want to sincerely thank each of the person who was able to participate. I also want to give a special mention to Leo Sky. I don't know whether Kimani, you can give a final. Leo Sky was helping us organize the webinars and the engagement that we've had. Kimani, if you're able to jump in and give a few remarks.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charles and KSA. Mine is just a big thank you to everyone involved, to the speakers, Davis von Ries, Meshach, and Ses. Thank you very much for taking time to share. And yeah, with different space entrepreneurs from across Kenya and Africa about what your experiences have been and what it looks like being in the field. That is it for me, Charles. I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and it's a wrap. And we hope you continue this conversation. And I think it's a good beginning to have this conversation within our community, so that again, like has been mentioned, the importance of engaging our community. So we call it a wrap, and have a good rest of your afternoon or the evening. And thank you so much. And let's continue the conversation.
Asanteni sana.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.